listening to a special version of the Insight Myanmar podcast, covering the military coup and the ensuing protest movement that has developed. During this crisis, we're ramping up the production of not only podcast episodes, but also our blog and other social media platforms. So we invite you to check these out as well. All the other projects that had been in progress prior to February have since been paused indefinitely to focus entirely on this emergency. But for now, let's get into our show.
Freedom by Langston Hughes. Freedom will not come today, this year, nor ever, through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course, tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed, planted in a great need. I live here too. I want my freedom, just as you.
I'm pleased to be joined today by Jessica Mudditt, who recently published a book called Our Home in Myanmar. She lived in Myanmar during the pivotal transition years between 2012 and 2016 and worked for a wide range of publications in the role of writer and editor, including the Myanmar Times, the Global New Light of Myanmar, the Democratic Voice of Burma, Mizama, Irrawaddy, Myanmar, Bangkok Post, as well as the UN's news service called IRIN. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Myanmar podcast.
Thanks for having me, Joa.
Yeah, so although you had little prior connection to Myanmar before going there, you described in your book how earnestly you endeavored to try to stay there despite the difficulties. And to give the listener a window into what you were facing, you struggled with getting employment, finding enough income to live in what was becoming a very expensive city. And then there was the whole visa debacle, which I think is probably familiar to any expat who was living there during that time. So given the extent of these difficulties and that you didn't really have a prior background of studying or writing about the country, what was the strong factor that drew you so much into wanting to stay as you did in spite of all these challenges?
I was determined to be there for the 2015 general election, and I wanted to see it through. So I arrived in 2012, and I wanted to know Myanmar well. So I didn't want to go to the country, for even a short stint, which I would consider a short stint a year. I wanted to be there at least until the election, and then the idea was that Sherpa and I would just reassess after that time, because it was such a, leading up, there was so much anticipation, and it would have been an incredible moment where everything that everyone was working for would culminate in Myanmar, ending a 50-year dictatorship and becoming a democracy.
Right. I didn't know that. So a lot of the drive that encouraged you to want to be there even before you came was knowing that this coming election was pending and how pivotal that would be for a country on the brink of between one system and another.
Certainly, I didn't arrive sort of, with this resolute determination. There were times when, there were rumblings that the elections would be delayed. You never really quite knew, but certainly I was hooked. Even though it was difficult, after a few months, you just want to remain and you want to see it through. I mean, as a journalist, I sometimes felt that I was actually seeing history unfold in front of me, which I'm not sure that I'll ever experience again in my life.
Right. So I want to get to all of the changes in Myanmar and some of the transition that you witnessed. But before, I just want to get to some of the personal stuff, because that was so much of what the book was about, and even the very title. So just on a personal level, personally speaking, what would you say you love the most about your time in the country?
I think it enriched me as a person because of the people that I met, and people's incredible stories, the courage and the dignity that they faced, incredible hardships in day-to-day life in terms of the poverty and lack of education and healthcare and opportunities and lack of freedom of speech. And also, people like Sunny Sway, the Burmese co-founder of the Myanmar Times. He was in prison when I arrived, and I went to the airport when he returned from the prison in Shan State after 7 years. And he'd spent several of those years in solitary confinement, and he was still such a warm, beautiful, glowing person. And he got straight back to work the following day. He was just, there were, repeated stories of people that I found so inspiring, like Zargana, the stand-up comedian who was tortured in prison. And the same man that tortured him, Zargana later went and visited in prison and provided food to him, and he forgave him for what he had done to him. And I was so inspired by that, and I think it definitely alters your perspective, hopefully permanently, and is very inspiring for me to face my own difficulties in my life, no matter how small they seem in comparison.
Right. And I think those are the stories that are so important to know now for those of us interested in the country as we're trying to understand this current moment and seeing the history of trauma and oppression and pain that has been there throughout so many past generations.
Yeah, absolutely. The same fortitude we're seeing that on the streets. It's interesting, sometimes in Australia, especially, with the debate around COVID, we tie ourselves up in such knots and we get so indignant over, what can seem like trifles. And then I compare that with the grace and the courage and the quiet determination to keep going. There's not sort of, it used to amaze me just on the streets. It would be, pouring with rain and flooded, and without over romanticizing it, but people just remained graceful as they waded through these enormous puddles. And that's such a contrast from me. I'm sort of flighty, impulsive, I can be ungainly, and I just find that the way that they have fought for democracy all this time has been really inspiring. And it's even more heartbreaking that, the people have been so peaceful largely. Obviously there is, many have now taken up arms, but I find the day-to-day people just so admirable in their grace.
Right. And you reference streets that get flooded. That certainly happens in the monsoon season. And there's a whole aspect of life in Myanmar that is different from other countries, a whole new set of experiences. And a lot of your book is about what it's like to set up that home. So can you go into some of the more challenging parts of what you faced as you went into setting up a home and a life in Myanmar?
Sure. Myanmar, as an expat, and I've been an expat in other countries, but Myanmar is unique in that, it had been in self-imposed isolation for 50 years when I arrived. And there is not a clamour, for, expats, please come in and, contribute to the economy. It's sort of been not self-sufficient, but certainly, it's an unmaterialistic society as well. So that's the backdrop against which there are then requirements of you, like needing to pay a year's rent up front, and it being extremely difficult even to find a property that, was vacant because there's no signs and there was no internet websites to tell you. And then the second problem was, okay, so we needed to pay 1 year's rent up front, but there's also no international banking. So, Shep and I just didn't have that amount of money. We didn't even own that amount of money. So then the next challenge was, how can we get the money in? So we had to really put our faith in our hotel manager, who we scarcely knew, to wire it in through, sort of an associate's account in Singapore. This was my father's money coming in. It was really, and then all the money is there and counted, and we signed the lease in Burmese. So these kinds of things that you possibly wouldn't put up with elsewhere, you have to take into the context that, Myanmar certainly has a lot of quirks because it has been closed off to the rest of the world for so long. So it just doesn't have the infrastructure and the systems in place to make it, easy to go and live there.
Yeah, that's totally true. And that thing of paying a year's rent in advance, that's such, the first time you go through with that, it's such a terrifying thing that I think that every foreigner who's been there kind of has their own story of just this incredible act of faith that you're coming into a place where you don't understand the contract and you don't really have a relationship with the people bringing you there. And you're just looking at, for many people, an amount of money that is physically in a bag and put on a table that you've never seen in your life, and just kind of hoping, making the right choice here. There's just, in other countries, you're just not quite faced with that kind of leap of faith of just like, okay, well, here's a year's rent, and I hope you're really the owner, and I hope this is legal, and and just going with it.
Exactly. And that there's no legal recourse. So there's no tenants tribunal, should you get a bad apple as a landlord. We actually did get a very troublesome landlord, but we knew that whatever her behavior was for the next year, we needed to stay, because you can't go and, appeal a decision or ask for your money back. Once you've given that money, you're done. I mean, what about the house? This was a very old house, and, many of the houses and, there's been no upkeep over the years, and that's sort of an understatement. So you also hope that the house will be still standing for a year. I know we did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that also underscores of how much of Myanmar, because of its history, is really built on the trust of those human relationships. And that, I'm just thinking of a story where I had an American friend who was setting up, he had a Burmese business partner, and he was trying to set up some kind of investment opportunity of a hostel somewhere. And he was asking me and a couple other foreigners who'd been there for a while some advice on the best way to set up the contract to really protect himself. And we just kept telling him, like, yeah, that's good. You're looking at the contract, and like you shouldn't have anything glaring, but like, really, that's not going to protect you. Like, that's not really going to matter at the end of the day. It's all about your relationship. You need to be putting much more thought into, like, what are the things that ties you and the other person together? How are you able to create a greater sense of intimacy with your business partner through shared contacts, so that the sense of potential betrayal or deceit in any way would just be so shameful, given this interconnecting of people, that it would not really be fathomable. That really would be much more to protect you than anything you would have in writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I found when I returned to Australia in 2016, and I had terrible reverse culture shock, I felt that Australia is one of the most heavily legislated Western nations in the world. We have a law for everything. But I missed a sense of just doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do, which I felt many Myanmar people did. They did not have any fallback. You don't go to the police station, if a crime is committed. And crime is very low in Yangon. I felt, and especially compared to other countries in Southeast Asia, I always felt that people had a really good social contract with each other, that, for the most part, people are very honest and do the right thing. And also that's, I'm sure, partly because of their Buddhist beliefs. And they also, everyone, lives their life with the full knowledge that the authorities are not there to help them, but will harm them. Like my cleaner said to me, don't go into a police station. People who go into a police station often don't leave.
Yeah, that's very true. And as the more you live and travel around to different kinds of communities, the more you see the extent to which they're taking care of their own, whether it's education or orphanages or healthcare or religious teachings or fixing the street light or the road or whatever. It's really I was really astounded from the very start of when I started living there of how much the community realizes that it needs to take care of itself because there's not that outside help coming. And as you say, that outside help would, at worst, would harm them, and at best would just kind of squeeze them a bit or make their life a bit more difficult.
Absolutely. And it's the same. I was so impressed not to, I scarcely saw homeless people because the monasteries will take them in and feed them. So there's this wonderful, which is interwoven with Buddhism, of course. But the other thing, just small details that struck me was the clay water pots for people to drink out of. You had to purchase a bottle of water, but there was, like you couldn't just, go to a tap in a playground or a park and, refill your water bottle. But this water that was there, for the passing monks, I thought that was quite beautiful that, delinquents never came along and stole the clay pots or anything. I just liked that.
Right. So as you lived there and settled more, in what ways did you find your expectations of coming there and what you'd learned different from what the reality was presenting itself?
There was some disappointments, as much as there were. I found it such an intoxicatingly beautiful place, even more beautiful, than the pictures I'd seen in Lonely Planet and things like that. But something that shocked me quite early on was the way that even journalists would show some Islamophobia. So I had a friend who was a translator at the Myanmar Times who was Muslim, and when she told me that the reporters would tease her and would say, "Oh, did you bring a bomb in your backpack to work?" Or they'd taunt her with their pork curries and say, "Do you want some pork?" knowing full well that she's a Muslim and she doesn't eat pork. And I found that really distressing. And that began, it was occasional in the beginning, but it did begin to ramp up around the 969 movement. And my husband had some really unpleasant exchanges, like when he was kicked out of a taxi when he told the driver that he was from Bangladesh, and kind of culminated in, the chapter I call Our Home in Myanmar, when we needed to find a new place to live. And the real estate agent had said to us, "Are you Muslim?" because landlords don't want to rent to Muslims. And we assured them that we weren't. But even so, on the day that we went round, with our bag of money, they to sign the lease, they fed us pork snacks just to be, 110% sure that we weren't Muslims. And that was a really awful and sad experience. And I don't think I reacted properly in the circumstances, but you also, if I had become indignant and given a speech about religious freedom, I think, I was sort of put in this awful situation where we'd finally found a home that was wonderful and that we needed for our animals. With also really, I was really compromised morally that day. I just shut up and played along and ate the pork and smiled, and I thought that was I was ashamed of what I did that day, but I was in Myanmar and I was trying to be pragmatic.
Yeah, and that was a really difficult set of years where this phobia was really just coming on at a fever pitch. I've never been anywhere where you've just seen the shapes and the contours of the forms it started to take. And of course, you were affected more than many with your husband being from Bangladesh. We actually, when I read that part in your book, it was quite interesting how much that paralleled something that happened to us. When my wife and I moved into our dream apartment, we had the contract to sign, and we had been in touch. We, as with you, we looked everywhere and had all these conditions and found the perfect one that met all of our needs. And we were actually friends with the family and everything was just perfect. And as we got the contract and read through it, there was one, actually, no, it was pointed out to us. So the son of the owner, who had spent time in the US, kind of with a bit of shame and kind of discomfort, pointed our attention to one clause buried in there that was something about how when we were to leave the apartment and if we were involved in helping them find new tenants, that we would we would not allow Muslim tenants to come and stay there. And we were, and so we had this real ethical moment there of trying to figure out what to do. And it was where that was a moment where I really reflected on how in some ways I take for granted the ethical stance of the country where I'm from. And not that America's perfect by any means, and we have a terrible record in a lot of civil rights stuff, but there is a basis that if there is legal persecution of a group, you can take that to various courts in the law and show how, like, look, I'm having to sign something that's forcing me to discriminate and I can't be put in this position. And in 2021, in most places in America, despite the problems we have, you are going to find that support. And so it really illustrated to me what ethical position it put you in when you knew that the law of the land would not protect you from forcing you to uphold certain kinds of prejudicial standards. And so we went through, our own process, talking to friends back home and kind of considering that, well, it's just something we're signing. It doesn't really mean anything's going to happen with that. This is another day where that happens. But what does it mean if we sign this and condone it? And how do we have the conversation? And so eventually we just kind of, you're in Myanmar not long enough, you kind of come up with Burmese solutions for Burmese problems. And we kind of gently went to the son and to other people associated with him and just kind of in a friendly way mentioned our discomfort with it. And that, look, we're looking to stay here for a while. And we just don't really like signing something that's in there. And he, I think without informing his father that because then that would cause a loss of face in that direction, the clause was just able to get removed and everyone was settled with it. But, it was definitely something to work through.
Wow. Yeah, I have not heard. See, possibly the first lease I signed in Burmese that I couldn't read had a clause like that. I mean, it was widespread, and I did find it shocking that racist remarks are openly expressed. And, as a society, Myanmar had not agreed that racism and, religious persecution wasn't, there was no agreement that it was wrong. It depended on, which group you were from. And that's, I do believe that's partly because of the isolation and, having a regime that, attempted to brainwash and spread really, really harmful views. But it is distressing when you handled that really well, I would say. I don't feel that I handled my situation well. I'm still not quite sure what I would have done, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it took a number of years of living in the country to start to, when those problems came to me, to start to realize that there were ways around, there were unusual ways around, or at least unusual for me to be able to find different alternatives than what jumped in front of me. And it really took, because I've lived there, 15 years or something. And it really took a number of years to, to not approach situations in the same way and start to look at kind of a maze walking around where, okay, we can get the solution I want and we just do it in this way. But getting back to the thing that you were saying about, basically looking at 2010s and some of the attitudes that we're developing. I had a Bamar activist on the podcast last month, and he was very aware and concerned when the Rohingya crisis started and was trying to raise awareness and share with his friends, and obviously was not successful. And when I asked him his reason of why he felt that that he couldn't carry this message, he described it as being, well, the 2010s were kind of like this opening moment for all of us of our dear leader finally, Aung San Suu Kyi, finally becoming in a leadership position. And, this was our chance on the world stage. We just didn't want anyone to throw rain on the party. We just wanted to finally enjoy ourselves after all these years of just being downtrodden. And he's not saying this in a way to justify, or in fact, he's extremely critical and negative about it, but he's just trying to describe the mindset of why there wasn't greater ethical action on certain kinds of things that were taking place, that it was an opening that everyone wanted to celebrate, and they just didn't kind of want to keep having their heads down and all the problems. They just wanted a moment of being able to be free. But of course, that was freedom for some.
And I think, Aung San Suu Kyi's reaction, filled everyone with dismay in the West. But back in Myanmar, it was what they had hoped their elected leader, that they were not on the side of the Rohingya. And neither was she. So that's when I think the gap was exposed between our expectations and reality. So because, it had festered for so long, and then when it was, openly genocide, no one could understand. But if you lived in Myanmar, you could understand her silence.
Yeah, and I think also you can't underscore enough what leadership of a country holding certain values does and how it permeates down to the culture of the rest of the country. We saw that in my country with Trump, and how certain values that he just openly espoused and talked about that were horrid started to become openly portrayed in America in ways we hadn't seen in generations. And I think in Myanmar, the way some of these anti-Islam sentiments started to get expressed by leaders in high positions, it just permeated and created a culture where you could openly have a clause in a contract that forbid this, and that started to exclude some members of society because that thinking was openly being discussed and shared from the top.
Yeah, it sort of takes your breath away when you see it so openly expressed. It's sort of, something else. I also had an exchange. I didn't include it in the book. When I was at the British Embassy. So again, my expectations were fairly high of my colleagues at the British Embassy. And a good friend of mine, with no malice at all, she was asking me about my husband and my in-laws. And I told her that Sherpa's father had been Muslim and he passed away when Sherpa was only 14. And her response to that was, "Oh, that's good for you." And I was so, I actually almost cried that she said that, my husband had lost his father, and she thought overriding that was how convenient for me it was that I didn't have a Muslim father-in-law. And it's just this enormous blind spot. This otherwise wonderful friend, a friend of mine, working in an international environment, could still hold those beliefs. And I think, Myanmar still has a lot of work to do in that regard, and a lot of work to undo all of these beliefs that have been permeated, at the school level and the day-to-day level, and how, unwinding that, I think, is an enormous challenge. But I feel that Myanmar's better than that. Do you think that?
Can you clarify what you mean by the question?
I think the people are so much better than that. They are such beautiful, kind-hearted, generous people in so many ways, and that this blind spot with the Islamophobia is not doing them justice.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was a perfect storm. I think it was a perfect storm of the internet and social media, and especially Facebook coming on as it did. And rural people went from barely having any access to news or information to suddenly having, Web 2.0 on their phone, and they had never even known how to use internet before. And that all this fake news was coming along at this time and hitting them so strongly. And that, America's quite an advanced nation, and look what fake news did for us in terms of what Russia was putting out during Trump, and the ways that affected even people in our country. And you're looking at, and we had a slow burn through the technology field, starting with radio, television, internet, et cetera, into where we were now. I mean, in Myanmar, it went overnight. I was living there during the time. It went overnight from having internet cafes that barely anyone even knew about or knew how to use, to suddenly there were phones and SIM cards that were affordable and everyone could have. And so to be living in a rural setting and have access to information coming to you and be able to discern where this information was coming, what it meant, how true it was, et cetera, I just think it was really asking a lot in those situations for people to, in a sophisticated way, be able to parse through that. And, that's been my view. On the other hand, I do have to say I'm shocked and disappointed by that urban sector of Burmese who I think should have known better, who who were fluent in English. They'd been abroad. They had international friends. They knew how to engage in critical thinking and how to go online or to engage to learn new things. Those were the ones that I really started to hold accountable, and really was shocked and disappointed at how much they were also drinking the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, but those people, who had been taught critical thinking skills, there's very few of them, I think, in Myanmar, because, the education system is rote learning. And I would also say, I mean, I think Facebook is the platform, and yes, it does disseminate fake news, but I believe the prejudice was already there and long ingrained by the military. They openly espouse that, Buddhism is the best religion, and the Burma, are the sort of chosen race, this kind of, almost eugenics thinking, at the expense of all the ethnic minorities and things. And I think, yes, Facebook sped it up and did it allowed shocking things to happen, sort of mob riots, violence, that type of thing. But I think on the whole, it only allowed people to exchange views that were already held.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think honestly, this is going to be something that we're going to be spending years and decades trying to figure out what the heck happened during this time. I think that in the people I've talked to, the evaluation we often come to is we are just too close to this to really quite understand everything going on. When it first broke, because I was in Myanmar much before this, before the transition in the 2000s, when the crisis and the anti-Islam sentiment started to initially be quite strong, it was quite shocking and surprising to me, actually, because the prejudice that I had seen up to that point, anti-Islam was, somewhere in the top 10, but probably in the latter order. They were not things I'd really ever heard or much from anyone. There was plenty of anti-Chinese, there was anti-Indian, there was the different ethnicities that got their share, and et cetera. But it almost seemed like a dartboard of just different groups, and somehow the dart hit a group that I wasn't really on my radar, something I was hearing a lot of at that time. And I think, of course, once that starts to develop and starts to become a thing, then you can go back historically and trace the history of the prejudice, and it's all there. I mean, there's nothing you're making up. There's a trajectory of all of that. But it's also that once you know the future, the past then takes on different connotations because you know how things turn out. But when I was living there in, say, like 2007 or 8 or something, and someone had told me what was going to be happening, if someone had said to me, in 10 years, there is going to be a minority group in Myanmar that is going to be severely prejudiced against, and, describe the things that were happening, the Islam would not have been my top 5 choices of who that group could have been.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Yeah, that is really interesting. I guess, my first coming from Bangladesh as well. So, again, I didn't mention it in the book, but we submitted and I shouldn't laugh because nothing about it is funny, but we submitted our visas to the embassy in Dhaka, and the following day was the very first acts of violence between the authorities and the Rohingyas in Rakhine State, and we got a call just to come and pick up our passports. They were just empty. But nothing said, just no sort of thing. And it was from there that then we had to go and try from Thailand. So for me, like, it was from the very before I was even there, I was aware of this tension.
Right. And I think that was when it was also starting to develop and starting to manifest, and also having a husband who would be on the receiving end of that prejudice would certainly change the whole way you looked at things.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So as you lived in Myanmar during this period of transition, one of those transitions, including not only Aung San Suu Kyi taking the role of leader, but also the views of her, which you made reference to just now, both within and outside the country. And she definitely has received steady support from Burmese during that period, but there was this increasing concern from abroad and from foreign observers, especially as the anti-Islam sentiments were growing. So as someone who has tapped into both worlds and also was a journalist at the time, how were you following her trajectory?
Well, I idolized her. I thought she, I held her in my mind as I did Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. And I think a lot of people did. And also, part of the appeal of going to Myanmar was, she had been released and I wanted to see her lead her country. And so I, was completely swept up. And you see her picture everywhere and picture of her father, Aung San, as well. All the taxi cab drivers have pictures of them. And so then when I got the chance, my first chance to see her, I think after that I saw her a few more times, but it was a small event where there was a book being launched at Emu Lake Hotel, and it was a beautiful photography book by an American photographer called Richard K. Duran, and she gave the speech. And, it was like she was a rock star, and, there was this media scrum that was, it was really intense before she came up. And then when she did arrive, all the cameras were flashing, and then she opened her mouth, and I was so taken aback. And I'd be interested to hear your views, but I found her lacking in the charisma I expected her to have as a speaker, and also in her chosen words. Like, it was sort of a bit of a flat delivery as she was talking, interestingly, about ethnic diversity in Myanmar and what sort of a potential future it had, because this book celebrated ethnic diversity. And I found her stilted. And interestingly, I later read Samantha Power's autobiography, and she was the UN's ambassador in New York. And she talks about, she went there with Obama to Myanmar, and they had a meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi. And Aung San Suu Kyi was totally uncooperative and cold. And I thought, okay, it wasn't just me, because I didn't even dare tell anyone what I thought of her except for Sherpa, because I thought I was the one lacking. And look, maybe I am. Maybe she was having an off day. But as I said, I've seen her speak again. And what surprised me was she had this really posh British accent that was not sort of the people as you imagine. And I have heard that she's a tricky character. I heard things at the embassy that, also I shouldn't repeat. But someone said to me one night at the Foreign Correspondents Club, a lot of people have pegged her wrong in the West. She is more, less Mahatma Gandhi, more Sonia Gandhi, sort of Margaret Thatcher. Right. She's tough. She's had to have been. And she can turn it on, this person said to me, but she would have to want to. And so from that moment that I first saw her, I guess that was the beginning of me readjusting the esteem in which I held her. I still honestly, yes, she's let everybody down, but she's back under house arrest as we speak, and I'm terribly sorry for that. And I also give her the credit she deserves for the things that she has done, as well as being disappointed in her for what she hasn't done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely a complicated character. And you also had some interesting observations, and you referred to part of that just now, but if you can go into more detail from what you had written in the book about the difference between Aung San Suu Kyi as a Burmese speaker addressing crowds and as someone who speaks English, not just in the words and the style, but in the overall charisma. You had some good observations on that.
Well, I mean, when there's also, the Burma-Myanmar question is, a bit of a political hot potato. So when she speaks in the Myanmar language, which I refer to in the book as Burmese, just because I find it, rather than saying the Myanmar language. So when she speaks Burmese, she refers to the country as Myanmar, and she always has. But when she speaks in English, in a very sort of, she did study at Oxford University, and she was in the UK for a quarter of a century, but it's really is quite a posh accent. And I've lived in London for 3 years, so I can tell the accents. And so I found that a little bit strange. There was not even like a hint of a Burmese inflection. And when she says Burma in English, she always says Burma. So if it used to be the case that if you supported human rights and democracy in Myanmar, you called the country Burma. And because Aung San Suu Kyi called it Burma, that is what you should call it. And because the military generals, without asking the people what they wanted, suddenly announced that the country would be called Myanmar. Western countries should refuse to call the country Myanmar. And continue to call it Burma. And when I worked at the British Embassy, it was still Rangoon and Burma.
Yeah,
These are,
yeah.
colonial names and a corruption of, the majority race, Burma. So, it really is very complicated, but everyone on the streets calls the country Myanmar. And so that was what I called it. And I found it odd that she persisted in calling it Burma. I know my government in Australia, you could see how, if it was their feelings towards the government at the time was hot or cold, because they would shift. Even the ABC would shift whether Myanmar was being called Myanmar on that particular day, or then they'd go back to Burma if they did something wrong, which I thought was a bit silly. So when Hillary Clinton came, I believe she came in 2011, before Obama came in 2012, she didn't call the country anything. She called it the country. So she didn't make up her mind. And then when Obama came, much of the anticipation was surrounding, would he call the country Myanmar or Burma? And he put a foot in both camps, because when he was with Aung San Suu Kyi on her balcony, he called the country Burma. And then when he met with President Thein Sein, he called the country Myanmar. But it was a big deal. It really signaled a shift, that this was an endorsement of the path that Myanmar was on. And it was such an exciting moment.
Yeah, right. And you were there in all of that, not just as someone living there, but also as a journalist. I mean, for a young journalist being there, that must have just been a really exciting time, as the whole profession of journalism was taking its first tentative steps towards this independence and free expression and reporting. So what was that kind of feeling and vibe like as it started to get off the ground?
It was wonderful. It felt that you were doing your own small part, in Myanmar's transition to democracy. There were topics. When I arrived at the Myanmar Times, there were 16 rules about, things that we weren't allowed to write about. One of them was ghosts, interestingly, spirits. We're not allowed to write about spirits. But, things like poverty had been off the table, because
Right.
that was a criticism of the military. And I remember interviewing the curator at the Strand Gallery, Jill Patterson, and she had shown me pictures that had been out the back. Like some of them she didn't show me, she told me. She said that she had all these pictures out the back. And the same, I think, with Pansadang Gallery, although I'm not sure if he ever played the game as much. But anyway, at the Strand Gallery, at the Upmarket Strand Hotel, she had these beautiful paintings by Burmese painters that she could never hang because they depicted poverty. So when I came in 2012, I think she was sort of testing the waters a little bit. But being able to actually hang up these beautiful paintings and performance art was beginning as well. Places were opening and you were able to go and interview the artists. They'd all done time. All of them had done time. If they were saying anything remotely important at all. Even the stand-up comedian who I mentioned earlier, Zarganar, he'd done a combined, I think, 15 years. Now, he's back in prison, which distresses me greatly, because he would never stop telling jokes about the military. And so to be a reporter and to be able to start to document people's lives, I did write for the UN's news service in Myanmar as well, and to be able to write about the way that old people were being treated. So I went to this home that was, vastly ill-equipped to look after people who were very frail. I Googled it, and I scarcely found another news article on the topic of elderly care in Myanmar. And to be doing that for the first time, you think, gosh, these are monumental problems and there is such a long road ahead. But this is the beginning of looking at this and seeing what is happening to these people who have never had the chance to tell their story, incredible stories. And I think it helps them. And I think, it is... I mean, I'm a journalist. Of course, I believe in the value of sharing stories. I think that's really powerful, and it, it sort of encourages empathy for each other in the different circumstances that we're in. So not only were these stories incredibly interesting, like the human hair trade, that, I was presenting to the Bangkok Post. So I thought, well, the readers have never heard about this before. I certainly never had. It's exhilarating and it's just so interesting. And you do feel enormous satisfaction. I'm not an overtly political journalist. Like I wasn't covering stuff in Naypyidaw. I do a lot of human interest and I also do a lot of business. But I realised that the military's tentacles, extend so far and permeate every aspect of life that all your stories have quite a life and death aspect to them. Even, business stories, because it's about giving people a chance to improve their circumstances. So I found it enormously rewarding. I also found it quite distressing. Really just very rewarding. And it was a real privilege to be there at a time when I was able to do that because, again, it's been plunged into darkness. If you go on the Myanmar Times website now, it literally goes black. And then a little pop-up box says, we've suspended publication for 3 months, and that was 6 months ago. So I was very fortunate to be there.
Right. That's an interesting observation, how the military's influence went everywhere. And I think that's something that is hard for people who weren't there at that time to understand. And there's a couple of stories that come to mind hearing that. One is when I was living there before the transition, I remember on television, there was this event of basically the Myanmar version of the Academy Awards, where they were just giving awards for different Myanmar movies. And it was all military run. So it was all like the judges and the presenters and the talks, they were all different people in the military. And I remember my friend turning to me and just saying, can you imagine if in our country, in the US, we had this and we had joint chiefs of staff and this kind of lieutenant and this general, just being at this award ceremony, talking about movies. And put that way, it was just like, man, that is wild. What does one possibly have to do with the other? And then the other story that came to mind hearing that is I spoke to one activist a few months ago on the podcast, and it was at the beginning of the coup, and he was just describing in very general terms what he was fighting for and why it mattered so much to him. And he's a devout Buddhist, and he was describing how for his childhood there was just abject poverty and among all of the monasteries that he was associated with. And he would go and serve monks and spend time volunteering to teach English to the novices. And there was the problem wasn't just the poverty that these monasteries were in and lack of resources even for the monks. It was that they could not adequately even tell their situation to potential donors within the country because, as you said, that would be shining a light on poverty. So in other words, they had to live in the shadow of poverty for an open-ended period because it would be seen as shameful and critical of the military to show how these monasteries were just barely surviving in the kind of poverty state they were in. And when the transition started and the openness began, these things could be reported. They could be talked about. And just by talking about it and admitting what the problem was, that allowed donations to come that weren't coming before. And so for him, he was looking at, this was one of several things he was looking at, but going back into a cycle of poverty of these monasteries not being cared for and upkeep. And, and this just, again, highlights the absolute hypocrisy of the military's claim that they're the ones that are protecting the Buddhism and that are keeping a strong monkhood, when you just get example after example after example of how, action after action, it's just destroying every infrastructure of the monk-lay relationship and the teachings and everything. And you talk to people that are devout Buddhist and that are involved in some aspect of meditation or teaching or whatnot, and just person after person just describes the flowering, and that's really interesting because you can think about a flowering of business or creative arts or education or opportunities, but you don't really know where to put, the conservative traditional monkhood tradition in that. But I mean, everyone I talk to that's in there, they just talk about how monks were now able to think more critically. They were able to have more control over their education programs. They were able to do more social services. They were able to get more donations because they could reveal what their needs were. And so every aspect of society, but certainly the religion, which is the thing that they say that supposedly they care about the most, was just flowering like never before when the reins came off there.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? And, the generals, what do? They just build another pagoda and think they've made merit, and they'll be fine in the afterlife. But I hope they
Right.
get their day of reckoning. There was one story that also, similar to yours, describes, the tentacles. So I was commissioned by a magazine in the UK that's all on paint. Can you do a story about Myanmar's paint industry? Because they were so hungry to do business. This is a large population and it's untapped. And I always had a difficult time explaining there's no data. Like, there hasn't been a census. And then when there was a census, there were millions of people missed, and there are just not trade figures. But anyway, I said, okay, I shall get you a report on Myanmar's paints industry. And I thought this will be as interesting as watching paint dry. And went and set off, and I met a person he distributed Japanese paints because the local quality was quite poor, if my memory serves me correctly. And he told me that the military had banned paint colours. There were only 4 colours that were allowed by law to be used. And after that law was overturned, you know how colourful people's homes are. There might be a wall that's purple and a wall that's a sort of fuchsia and then another one that's peppermint green. Like, there's a sort of, it's a riot of colour inside and outside people's homes. And he said when people had the freedom to choose what paint colour they were allowed to use, well, they enjoyed their freedoms. And I just thought, wow, was there anything the military didn't think of to control the population? Could they not have let anyone had the freedom to choose anything under their rule? It's just extraordinary. And that, that story I found without exception, whether I was reporting on meat or the auto industry or anything, there was always the sector had been tainted by, shall we say, the quirks of the military and their megalomania.
Yeah, absolutely. And for you to be there in that time, seeing this transition take place from the view of a reporter, that definitely gives an inside perspective into what's taking place. And as you were there, and you were obviously a foreign reporter and you were working with the local journalists getting off the ground, how would you characterize the relationship between these local and foreign journalists?
It was language inhibited us being closer. So even in the Myanmar Times office, not all of the reporters spoke English. And I became closest to Thierry, who was a translator, who was really keen to improve her English. But as the Myanmar Times had... we had a Burmese paper and an English paper, and people like Thierry translated those stories. So there was a great deal of shyness, but I became friendly with a lot of the photographers because we were truly collaborating. So we might go out somewhere, and so Countet or Boothie or Cote would take the photos, and I'd do the reporting. And, sometimes we travelled there together. So Countet had a car. So we did quite a number of freelance stories, and I got to know the photographers quite well. I had a lot of respect for the Burmese reporters, and I did mentor some in the newsroom and how much they wanted to improve. And this was the same at the Global New Light of Myanmar. There were some journalists there who were intent on improving their English skills, and they were so eager for me. They were a delight to work with because they wanted to learn. And sometimes I felt, not up to the task of, some of these situations were so complex. And I also, I did a workshop in Naypyidaw with the military newspaper and the other state-run newspapers, and I found this same hunger to learn from the young journalists there, and some of the incredible stories. That if you love being a journalist, this is a universal. We're a universal people, and we just get along. You know what I mean? And so, I was quite frankly amazed by some of the things that they told me, the courage. I'm not sure that I would have had the courage as a foreign reporter. I didn't think I faced imprisonment. I thought I faced being deported. That was possibly, I did worry about Sherpa, and I did stay away from certain stories in case he was used as a pawn. Because again, I knew that they could do something to him, and I would have no legal recourse to that. So I just had such admiration for them. I do wish we could have been closer. But I do think, again, language sometimes inhibited that. And also you had a lot of, there were sort of the English language publications. There were a few of them, but then there were a lot of Burmese only publications. But I was really good friends with my husband's colleagues at his newspaper. And I just, had some wonderful friendships with many young women as well. In fact, at Myanmar Times, there was definitely a strong female majority, which I also liked.
And how would you characterize the attitudes of some of the foreign journalists that were coming there at that time to begin reporting?
Well, it was competitive. There were some big egos. There were, and I'm sure it's the same. Well, maybe it's the same in aid work, or if you're a teacher or something. There's a bit of jostling, like who's breaking the biggest stories, who's got the best connections, who's the most, sort of serious journalist, like who's doing the really hard-hitting stories and if you're writing for the Washington Post or New York Times or something, you really are, you're a cut above the rest sort of thing. So I organised the foreign correspondence journalists because I found it was a little bit cliquey in the beginning. Like, we were a small community and it seemed a waste that there was so much rivalry and just a little bit of hostility. I thought, come on, we're all in this together and I'm sure we've all got similar stories. Not everyone went to the Foreign Correspondence Club drinks. We just had these informal drinks. But I think it did make it a bit friendlier and kind of, when you get to know someone, it's harder to be competitive. And I was just as competitive as the rest of them. I was like, territorial. I was like, I've been here longer than you. Like, you should show me respect. I had been treated the same way in the beginning. And you think, what am I doing? Like, why do I have this ego? It's so stupid. But you can't help it. When, this upstart walks into the newsroom and starts just like filing these amazing stories, you're like, what? How did you do that? You're jealous. And there was a lot of that because, there were some really big stories. Like, there was a lot of international interest. So you may work for the Myanmar Times, but you'd be a stringer for, perhaps the newspapers in your home country. And, some people did that incredibly well and some of us floundered. And there were also, perhaps some irresponsible characters who did come in sort of guns blazing, may not have been protective enough of their sources, not quite understanding the dangers that they could put their sources in. And, of course, that would then be condemned roundly by the community of journalists behind their back, that sort of thing. There was a bit of argy-bargy sometimes, but also wonderful. Like, I had some wonderful nights out with my colleagues. So it was, and I remember thinking in Myanmar, you could go to a party and you could walk up to anyone and say, what are you doing here? Like, what brings you to Myanmar? And they'd have an interesting story. Like, I found basically everybody interesting. Whatever brings a person to Myanmar, they were not your average person who just wanted to work a 9 to 5, and have a comfortable existence. They wanted something a bit more from life. May have been because we were all a bit lost or, curious, but I had a lot of respect for the other people in Myanmar. And that was the same for the journalists. Like, it wasn't a walk in the park, and if you stayed there, you realised that. And so, I always found I love going to the foreign correspondent drinks and hearing about the stories that other journalists were doing. Because as I said, like, I'm a human interest and a business reporter, and I really admired people who were really going to Rakhine State and seeing the camps, which I knew it would leave me traumatised, and doing that, and that was their regular beat. I would think, wow, you're brave and you can handle a lot.
Right. So definitely you hit the nail on the head. And Myanmar being a place where those who came to live definitely had a story for why they were doing what they were doing. And I definitely found that as well. I'm curious about the journalists, especially what you found their range of motivations were for why they wanted to come to Myanmar at that time. For you reference how you were just really psyched and intrigued by this coming election, but how would you characterize the range of other motivations of why the foreign journalists, specifically in that profession, would want to come and set up shop there?
Myanmar was a hot story. It became the new travel darling. It was all, it has Aung San Suu Kyi, who is, she can cut through the noise, in the world section of the newspaper pretty much, every time. It was an incredible narrative leading up to the election, and media outlets were interested. I can't even think, with the pandemic, it's hard to think, but of a country where, it felt, even though some people sort of called it a backwater, of Southeast Asia, it felt like all the world's eyes were on Myanmar, when Obama came twice and that sort of thing, and in the lead up to the election. So I think it was, there were professional opportunities for journalists, and they were coming in greater and greater numbers. Like, I want a piece of that action. Like, this is one of the world's biggest stories. And it's an enchanting story of, good and evil, and democracy and dictatorship, these really, really big, important principles. But then it's also interesting there, and see, you're a long-term expat. I'm not sure what you would make of this, but some of the journalists that had been there like a decade before I came, they intrigued me as well, because what had brought them there? You could scarcely do journalism.
Yeah.
Like, the Myanmar Times, it was ridiculed because it had social pages, of like people drinking cocktails and stuff.
I remember those. Yeah.
Why are you doing these lighthearted pieces in a country that has some of the worst poverty rates in the world? But business goes on and functions continue. I don't know. It is so interesting. For me, it possibly would have been a bit too dark. Like, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. It'd be like going to North Korea now, I think, where you're just kind of perpetuating the regime, whatever nonsense it's spouting. Like, when I joined the Global New Light of Myanmar, I was like, I'm doing this partly because it's fascinating, but partly because they want to change the newspaper and make it reflect a more democratic Myanmar. But the old hand journalists, like the ones I met when I was in Myanmar, started working at the Myanmar Times, their knowledge was unbelievable and incredibly intimidating as someone that had just arrived. And, they spoke Burmese and stuff, and had Burmese wives and that sort of thing. And I think it's, I don't know, you're just fond of the place or something. And then compared to the journalists, though, that sort of came in, the beginning of 2015, okay, right, let's hold the election. Yep, let's do it. Okay, next assignment. You'd kind of feel like, didn't you fall in love like a little bit, But I guess, like, if you're with the BBC, like, I know Jonah was fascinated by Myanmar, but when his time was up, he moved on. That was after 3 years. But there are some kind of like wham, bam, thank you, Sam type journalists, and they chase the headlines. And that's what they do really well. I'm just not that kind of a journalist. I think I'm actually more of an author than a journalist, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. So you referenced this 2015 election, this pivotal election that so much was centered around. And then after the election, of course, there was a period of transition that has now gotten so much attention, and that different people have different views of what exactly was taking place, what was happening and what wasn't happening. So for journalists that were on the ground covering these democratic reforms, and to whatever extent was possible as they started to take shape, how would you find journalist views, journalist perspectives on watching this unfolding? What was their opinion about the, the authenticity of what was taking place?
It's interesting. I was just thinking about my previous response, and I didn't miss a category of journalists who work for incredible publications like the New York Times, and they come into Myanmar very quickly, do their story, leave, and they do that over many, many years. So they do know the country well. I remember having some frustration. There was sort of a cohort of really quite young journalists, because there were internship opportunities and that kind of thing. And, Myanmar's political situation and the history is so complex to sort of I remember trying to get my head around the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi's father founded the military.
Right.
And her father was personal friends with the military guys. So as a child, she played at their houses. And so there was this closeness of the relationship, that it wasn't actually as black and white. They're on the good side and they're on the bad side. And someone told me in the context, well, maybe that's why they haven't killed her, because they know her very closely. Some of them do hate her with a passion, but she's also, the daughter of her father, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, I don't know, I think Myanmar is almost so complicated that to go in and try and do a story on your first visit in a month, you definitely miss some important pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people came in, here for a good time, not a long time kind of thing. I want to get the stories and may have missed the nuance of those stories and present things a bit too simplistic. It's in a simplistic way that missed. And also, we as journalists, we have word counts. So you have this incredible, like your editor goes, get me 600 words on, the persecution of Chin people. And you're like, that's so hard to do.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I wrote a book. And so that's really hard as well. And readers are, typically aren't interested in the complexities. But I did meet some characters who I thought, you are biting off more than you can chew, and slow down. But look, I was the same, because if you're young and ambitious, you want to make your career and you want to make it around something like an election. But it was every man and his dog around 2015, and it was I suppose you've heard the term carpetbaggers. People used to joke about, the lost souls and misfits turning up in Yangon to sell their wares and their knowledge, and they'd hold all these workshops about absolute nonsense and try and make a buck. So, there are those kinds of shady professionals, I think, that were circulating, and some were sharks as well. And just kind of trying to, capitalize on vulnerabilities and an immature market, for certain products or whatever. And I think that was the same with the media. There were some shonky players and some incredible players. I hope that's fair.
Well, it was a really wild west, I think, in every profession there was, from real estate to journalism to teaching to business opportunities. I think it was just absolutely a wild west period.
Yeah, and, education. You could come and set up the school for Mickey Mouse, and say that'll be a couple of grand a term. And make some funky website and claim, degrees from so-and-so and it be absolutely hollow in its promises. So, and again, no regulation. So it was Burmese people have, a sort of moral compass on the whole, but a lot of opportunistic people there was some shameful characters, weren't there?
Yeah. And I think that it reminds me of this line that you had in your epilogue. It's my favorite line in the book. You said that Myanmar's sudden return to a dictatorship means that I have inadvertently written a history book. That's a great way of looking at how you went on to capture your life in this country and as it was going through this transition, but suddenly the door had closed at the end of your writing, and you were now writing about something that was no longer, and how shocking to the system that was. And it made me think of a number of things, and also in what you just said reminded me of that as well, in the sense that if you have this Wild West period of this, the reforms taking place and these new opportunities, but also kind of a lawlessness of anything goes and not a lot of legal protections, and people, you mentioned some sharks that were there, people with bad intentions, also some real entrepreneurs and people with ambition. Everything was thrown into the mix of what was happening. And I think if you were to plop in the middle of that, I don't know how you'd make sense of it. I mean, I did have people I came to be friends with that came in the middle of that, and it was really fascinating having conversations with them, because their perspective of what they had dropped in the middle of, not knowing the context, and mine knowing where it had come from and living through that period of going from where we were before to now, made us look at those situations and experiences very, very differently. For me, it was a mix of seeing this kind of Wild West and for what it was, and the challenges of that, but then also knowing that there simply were opportunities of a kind of quality of life that were never there before. And anytime I would see some new business start to take off, like homemade yogurt or a pet hotel or a service where they would come and cut your grass, or organic soil or a farmer's market, like any of these things, I celebrated them. I was thrilled. Like I've never rooted for businesses to succeed as much as during that time. I would just, I'd buy some homemade yogurt. I would think, man, this is great. And I'd just be like, God, I hope these guys succeed. Like, this is so great what they're doing. Cause I had lived through a period where like this stuff was just unimaginable. To have anyone who had any kind of decent lifestyle was not a good person, because there was no way to be, middle class or comfortable in any way and have any ethics, because you had to be a crony to get there. And so to see people taking their passions and their loves and trying to build some kind of entrepreneurial thing around it, I just celebrated it, and I loved it. And I think also what was funny as well is when I would meet people and they would find out I'd been in Yangon X number of years, 10 years or whatever it was at that time, they would often flash like a look of horror on their face of like, how, like, you are crazy. How could you? And I would try to explain, like, Yangon today is not Yangon 5 years ago. You can't understand it. Like, it was like, this was and this was the mix of the shifts from one phase to another. As much as now we have these freedoms and opportunities and these all these cool people doing cool things they were never allowed to do, we also have this like traffic from hell and this, the what was going on with the real estate bubble and everything else. And the Yangon before was a much calmer city as far as a foreigner goes. I mean, I know that you don't have the kinds of freedoms or safeties that was under the military ship. That goes without saying. But it was also like, it was a really quiet, calm, peaceful town. It was easy to talk to people. There was never traffic. I'd never seen traffic in my life. You can get anywhere to anywhere in 20 minutes. You could also, you'd see the road under your feet because, the cars were in such a condition that, they were all basically from the 50s and 60s because they weren't having imports at that point. But it was just really a night and day difference in terms of what you got back then and then what you got during that transition. And then, as you say in the book, that itself is now history. And it's so interesting how you look at the progression of time, because up until a few months ago, you would see like, okay, well, you had these kind of old days that the door is closed and now this rough transition is starting and things are kind of chaotic and we'll see where that goes. And then all of a sudden you readjust your whole view of history and you say, oh, well, actually it's been this extended dictatorship with just this little window where some things were attempted. And then it kind of went back to how things always were. And you realize that the door and the gate that was closing was actually not the military dictatorship leading to the rough transition. It was actually the rough transition was actually this moment of sunlight that itself was closed, and then it readjusted, at least for now, back to those very bad old days.
Yeah, it's true. And what you were saying, like, how you celebrated every new business, it's interesting that I don't think the military really thought through everything that comes along with democracy. And that is that, wealth is more spread out, certainly not as concentrated as they would like it to be. And I was watching Foreign Correspondent last week on the ABC, and they had a Burmese specialist say that she believes that the origins of the coup are the military men, a very select number of them, feeling that their economic interests were threatened by a more robust democracy. And it's true, because they don't have the stranglehold, over everything as they would like. And to me, it's like they've had a temper tantrum, and we don't want to share. We don't want to share with, with everybody else. And we don't want to give up all our vested economic interests that you're going to make us, do. So I feel like they sort of weren't prepared for that. Like, there were new opportunities because there were more people to sell their whiskey to or whatever. But there was also competition, international competition and local competition that was coming about, through hard, honest work, which is, what I always celebrate anywhere, anytime. And people with fresh ideas compared to their stale, like, they don't even know how to think what people want, because they don't eat the products they sell. They eat everything they have comes from Singapore or China or whatever, like the best of the best. So they don't really know, because they're living in this sort of separate fantasy world. So they, and they don't know how to do marketing and all those kinds of things because they never had to. Like, you don't have to entice people to buy your product when there's only one product. right? Like the Global New Light of Myanmar, when it's the only newspaper, it can be of any standard. So I think they kind of had a wake-up call, and there were a lot of sort of unpleasant realities hit home, and that they feared, you know, a greater relinquishing of their economic interests, and also probably greater transparency over what you own that, and that's how, you know, jade goes to China. No, you know, that kind of thinking that, you know, threatened them. So it's really sad that this terrible political situation could have economic origins. But I think a lot in the world does have economic origins, and it makes me really sad when, you know, young people especially, like I have a friend, Nin, who was running Father's office. It's opposite the Secretariat. And she was a refugee, came to Australia and returned to Yangon, and she wanted her life to be in Yangon. And so she set up this fantastic bar called Father's Office, you know, with nachos. And we had some talks there with the Myanmar Foreign Correspondents Club. And the last time I saw her on Facebook, obviously she'd had to close her bar, and she was making placards, you know, in a garage. And I think her talents are being squandered. She's an events hospitality guru, and she should be giving people pleasure and joy and great nights out. But she is having to make placards, and she could be harmed or shot, you know. And I get very upset that seeing these people who are so talented having to turn back to the most basic of tasks, like feeding themselves.
Right.
I saw a picture on Facebook, just by the way, of the caption was "What passes for a meal in Myanmar now," and it was a shuck of garlic and a stick of bamboo. So people are boiling bamboo. You know, this is terrible. They've had to go back to fighting for day-to-day existence. You know, when the bottom of the pyramid was starting to look as though it was filling out, and people could start to achieve and go after their ambitions and their career goals. And I'm sure you find it as upsetting as I do to be seeing this.
Yeah, well, I spoke to one Gen Xer on the podcast whose quote always sticks with me. She said, you know, I wasn't expecting to have this revolution. I came up fighting for gender rights. I came up fighting for like the role of women in society. All of a sudden, I'm fighting for basic human rights. Is like, what's going on? You know, and that just really struck with me with how far, you know, she was trying to advance a certain cause forward, and now she was going so far backwards that she couldn't contemplate it. And in hearing what you said now, I don't know how, but I just had this really strange juxtaposition of stories in my own mind that go together. I'll explain them. I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but I'm going back like 20 years to like when I was a college student, and I skipped a week of class to fly to New Orleans, and I went for a Mardi Gras for a week, which is like totally uncharacteristic of me. But I did it, and it was a great time with friends. And I remember this. I have never been in the South. This was basically the only time in my life I'd ever been there just for Mardi Gras. And one of the afternoons I was out with Mardi Gras, the kind of event you just kind of become friends with whoever's around you and start drinking and having a good time and talking. And so I'm out on the street, just kind of like sitting on sofas and talking to all the random people, having a good time, drinking beer, whatever's around. And this old man, I'll say he's old white man, because this indicates where the story's going. This old white man walks down the street just staring at us, and kind of walks close to me, and he almost has tears in his eyes. And he said, I can't believe that this is actually happening. I can't believe that I'm seeing young white and black men outside casually drinking and having a good time and being friendly with each other. I can't believe this is taking place on the street. And that stood out for me so much, because I'm not from that era. I've learned about it, but that's not the culture and history I've grown up in, and was just a very powerful moment. And I want to juxtapose that with my memory of going to the farmer's market in Kandaji Lake in Myanmar. And I'm at this farmer's market where it's just like, it's probably a B-rated farmer's market anywhere in the world, but it's, you know, it just has, but it's pretty cool. It has the, you know, it has like the roasted coffee, and the guy who makes his own ice pops and kombucha, and like, of course, all the, you know, organic soil. And then of course, what you need in every farmer's market, just the fresh herbs and vegetables and fruits and everything. And everyone's just kind of going there, you know, Burmese and foreigners, and they're just filling their baskets and everything else. And I've never made this connection till now, but I mean, I almost had tears in my eyes when I was there. It's just like, I cannot believe, like, I have the history of this place, of both experience and friends and reading, and like, on a sunny day, we're just in a farmer's market, just with like everyone just like bringing their passion of what they're making and everyone
It's
benefiting from it.
wonderful.
Yeah. And it's beautiful, beautiful. And just like, and like the old white guy in New Orleans, just having tears in my eyes and everyone's just enjoying themselves. And it's just one other day. And I'm just like, I can't believe this is happening here. I mean, this seems, and I was with friends who were visiting from out of town, and I was trying to explain to them, like, I know you've been to farmers markets before, but like, this is happening here, you know? And so like every stage of the transition, when those things would happen, I had that context in mind of like, well, this is where it was coming from. Like, and they've achieved this. And that doesn't mean I wasn't frustrated by all the things that you mentioned being frustrated in your book, which was the expat experience there. But it was also, I understood where it was coming from. And that was a big difference in terms of the friends who were just plopped there and didn't quite have that appreciation of when things not working, didn't quite understand where they were coming from and why they weren't working and where they had arose from. And now those same friends understand it perfectly. Like, oh my God, I was not in a country that was just kind of like a little bit wild and crazy and chaotic. I was in a country that was having like a brief moment in the sun that got stripped away from them. And now everything kind of looks different when I look back on it.
I think, I mean, it's how beautiful everyday life is when you are free to enjoy it and when no one's meddling, you know, with just like a day. It's a simple thing, but it can be so beautiful and peaceful. And I think life is beautiful and peaceful when people are allowed to, you know, lead their lives. But the other thing I would just say, those stories, that's a beautiful juxtaposition. I think we should never underestimate the pace of change in a generation. So you can be astounded by, it was probably half a decade. Or, you know, say, you know, it was the full decade. And that man, you know, it was from his, you know, childhood to his adulthood. But I hope that the same applies with Myanmar. So young people today can stand around, perhaps, you know, fifth generation technology where they're, you know, sending their e-vote in or something and say, you know, my parents were having to scrounge for food during the military takeover, and look where we are now, you know, with our electronic cars and our civil liberties restored. So I really hope things can go bad so fast and they can also improve, you know, and I really hope that's the case for Myanmar. And I don't feel like, you know, you've described the decade, you know, the experiment with democracy, but I don't call it an experiment with democracy. I don't think Myanmar's story is over. And I believe that the people will get there in the end because they are so determined. Because I feel what's the alternative? You know, the alternative is to live a life of total darkness. And I've heard a number of protesters say, this is the last fight. This is it. Like, even if we lose, this is the last fight. And I'm still optimistic for Myanmar's future because I don't think you can, and it's so utterly ridiculous, the whole proposition of this coup. You know, let's have a coup to restore democracy. What on earth? And I don't think the people are going to swallow it. And I am really hoping that this is turned around, and sooner rather than later, because I think Min Aung Hlaing's days are numbered, to be honest. And that what I hope is that this is the end of the military taking up too much space in society, and people say, let's clear the decks. You know, I've heard people say, let's clear the decks of the NLD as well, and let's start again, and you know, build from the bottom, and a society that's inclusive. And we can avoid some of the missteps of the past. That's what I hope. Like, I have days where I feel so despondent about it, but I'm still optimistic. Are you optimistic?
What a question. You know, it's I haven't been asked that, at least not on air. But it's a pretty simple question, but my answer is not, and maybe somewhat surprising, not because it's negative, but because I actually don't really think about it. I just think about what I need to do during the day or the week or the different tasks. I think about where does my influence extend and what is, I think this is kind of how I came to understand my own role and involvement, which is what everyone had to do inside and outside the country. Even if that involvement was no involvement, everyone had to go through some period of just determining how do I feel about this and how do I respond and what do I do? And I think one of the ways that I organized my own effort around it was that I cannot leave anything on the table. I just can't do that. I just need to, I need to know that I'm doing everything I can for people who've done so much for me. And if I'm doing everything that I can, and then I can't do more, and I don't feel guilty. And I feel that however things turn out, at least I am doing every single thing in my power day after day that can affect things in some small way. And if I'm doing that, that's the most that I can do. And I actually don't think much beyond that. I mean, I think very much in terms of what am I doing? Is it the best use of my time? Could I be doing something? Is there something more that I could be doing than this, and racking my brain with that? I spend a lot of time with that, but I don't really, I just kind of, maybe it's from my spiritual practice or view of the world, but I think that what you do and the effect it has are kind of two different things, and that I can't control the effect it has or the effect of what people are doing, but I can control everything that comes into my sphere. And I just don't want to leave anything on the table with what I could be doing. And I just kind of take it one day at a time. And I've had those same high days and low days in terms of friends, good news and bad news, national good news and bad news, rumors that are tantalizing and rumors that are terrifying. And through it all, it's just kind of like, okay, what do I got in front of me, and how much can I get through, and how good can I do that job? So I hope that's not an unsatisfying answer.
No, because we do not know. Like I can say, I think democracy is going to be restored, but I don't actually know that, So it's a choice, kind of, whether you're optimistic or not. I mean, I like to think the facts inform my choice, but I think you're acknowledging that the future is uncertain, aren't you?
It's uncertain, and also acknowledging that if you study history, the way things turn out are on a dime. Anyone, even the casual observer of World War I, knows that the events that set it in motion were basically an accident. It was a failed assassination of an archduke that the driver took him in the wrong getaway street that had him stuck in traffic next to a sandwich shop, where the failed assassin was sitting right outside and ended up finishing off the assassination. That's what kicked everything off. I mean, if you're looking at like how event and that's not an aberration. When you really start to study how these things happen, they do happen on a dime, and there's things that are unpredictable, and little things end up being the things that turn it. And so those of us that care about this, if we can be involved in those little things that maybe they mean something and maybe they don't, but it's the most that we can do. And as many doors as we can open, as many things as we can put out there, who knows? One of those things might be the thing that is able to not be a miracle, but just be the right thing at the right time where the conditions match. And if no one's doing that, as has happened in previous revolutions of '88 and such, where there wasn't the kind of coalition we're seeing now, then you're not really creating those opportunities for yourself.
No, I agree. I think it was Margaret Mead who invented the contraceptive pill, who said never underestimate the power of what a group of ordinary citizens can do, in small acts. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, yes, the, defining moments of history can be, down to individuals and unfortunately personalities, that really annoys me. But I think the response to those acts are, this quiet persistence that will just not be defeated and will not go away.
Yes, right.
And I hope that's the situation here too, that it's just no, we just don't accept it and we never will. And, when that truth is finally realised by, and we see, Min Aung Hlaing, he's sort of, he's like, oh no, it won't be the start of next year. It'll be August next year that we have elections. I do think he's thinking about it. And I think that there must be some shock at just how strong the opposition to this has been.
Yeah.
And maybe he can be pressured into giving up the game. And in the same way that Tan Shui, reportedly he didn't want to stand trial in the international criminal court. So he walked away in a way that allowed him to, live out his retirement quietly. And Myanmar, and sort of, he didn't get the applause, but I mean, he also, wasn't prosecuted and he should have been prosecuted. Maybe, maybe we could see a similar exit plan for Min Aung Hlaing.
Right. So knowing how things turn out later, it always influences the way you look back and examine how things played out in the past. And we talked about that a bit in the anti-Islam issues that developed in the 2010s. In that case, certain things will stand out more than others. Some will take more of a background view. It's kind of like this mystery movie with a twist ending, where then when you go back and watch what happened, the scenes take on a totally different understanding because you realize how things turned out. And where I'm going with all this is your description of the 2015 election in your book. You give this insider's view of the kind of fear that was at play 6 years ago about whether the military would honor the result, and that there was talk even at that time of a possible coup. But there were really few people outside of your circle who were privy to how fragile that moment was. And I think you do a really excellent job of portraying what it was like to live in that moment. And as we know, it turned out very different. You write how Min Aung Hlaing accepted the democratic process, and that was the sign that it had really worked, that we were turning the corner. Yeah, it was amazing.
Because I wrote that, and then when I went, after the coup, when I reread it, I thought, my goodness. Yeah, shivers down my spine sort of thing. Because I wrote it completely unaware. That way. It was just,
I felt that way when I read it. It was like kind of like, what did I just read? Oh, right. This was 2015. Okay. So, so what was it like for you living through and reporting on a period where you didn't know if certain freedoms would be maintained or taken away?
It was frightening in the lead up to the election. There was a real worry, and that had come from what I never really understood was, management at the state-run newspaper where I work said that our office might be attacked, and they were stepping up security, and they had moved the drums of chemicals. And I was like, I didn't know there were drums of chemicals. And I knew that the ballot papers were being printed next door, but what I couldn't understand, I thought, we are the state. Like, we're the state-run newspaper. Who's going to attack us? Okay, I understand if, the Irrawaddy or Democratic Voice of Burma, should there be a military coup, but why would we be attacked? So I didn't quite understand who the actors were. And that was in the same way that I didn't understand who was censoring me, like at the state-run newspaper. I thought that I didn't expect to be censored, to be honest. And the way that it was done, I called this man the man in the clouds because we did not know who he was. Maybe Wallace, the news editor, knew, but this is how the Myanmar state operates.
Yeah.
And so it was frightening because I didn't have all the information, and I knew I didn't have all the information. And I knew that possibly some things, weren't being conveyed to me. And when I told my former boss at the embassy, I knew that she knew that there was a risk of violence. I mean, people on this, Yangon is also quite a rumour mill because there aren't formal channels of communication. When you haven't had Facebook and things like that, I think they just kind of pop up, and those kinds of networks are quite strong. And so there were all sorts of rumours. Like, again, as you say, there'd be good news one day, bad news the next. And like the Union Election Commission would say, oh, I think we might need to delay this incredibly historic election. I don't think we should do it. And it was like the whole time, the military have a history of overturning election results. Were they getting cold feet? It was like the nervous groom in the lead up to the wedding day. Was this going to happen or not? And suddenly they can just pull the rug out from underneath you. Nope, sorry, that was without any need to explain. But we're just going back to what we know. And so it was. I was frightened. I was frightened for my safety. And so then when the election day passed so peacefully, on the whole, and it was just so beautiful, it was a really emotional day. And to have that symbol of, people whose pinkies had been dipped in purple ink so that they could only vote once. It was like, this is a robust, transparent democracy, and for many people, the first time that they'd ever voted. But it was even, touch and go, because the official results, again, they weren't announced, I think, 3 weeks after the day of the vote. And so there was still that time of anticipation. Is this going to be undone? Is this going to be undone? And then everyone just collectively exhaled. 5 years pass of, Aung San Suu Kyi's government being in control. Things actually slowed down. It's a bit disappointing, but good. On the whole, good. Myanmar is, no longer as newsworthy for all the wrong reasons. And then for February 1, suddenly back to a coup was the most shocking piece of news, that I have ever been struck by. I just didn't believe it. I thought it was rumors. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it, let alone how do Burmese people feel? Absolutely, torn to pieces.
Were you fearing that at all in the run up? Was it
No.
totally off the radar to you when it happened?
Yes, it was. It was. I hadn't even heard the rumblings. I was working on finishing my book and sort of doing that every day, and I'd recently gone back to work from maternity leave, and I didn't have my finger on the pulse in Myanmar, and I didn't think I had to. So those I hadn't heard the rumors. And so, I heard before it happened. I did hear that as things were getting serious. So I heard prior to February 1, but not long before. And I just thought that it was a hoax or something, like a terrible, terrible joke.
So that's interesting. You were fearing and following the possibility of a 2015 coup, which didn't turn out, and you were off the radar, not paying attention to a 2021 coup that did happen.
Yes, because I am a trusting person, and I didn't actually comprehend the possibility. Which I guess is a bit silly, really, because, Myanmar's capacity to surprise is just limitless. But I just didn't. I really thought the big one was 2015, and I thought after 5 years of getting used to it, when, Aung San Suu Kyi had not pushed her agenda, the military still had their 25% of seats, and I thought she'd done too good a job, perhaps, of accommodating them. So it was, quite remarkable that this, tantrum occurred to me. Now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, yes, I can see why perhaps, Aung San Suu Kyi has walked a tightrope for so many years, and I didn't fully appreciate, just how, what an incredible path it was to take for her. She would have known all along, I think, how fragile her situation was. I'd love to know how surprised she was by this. And to find herself back under house arrest. Yeah. Did she find it inevitable? I don't know.
Yeah. So since the coup broke then, what has surprised you most about what we've been seeing in the way that the people have responded?
Well, the way that the people have responded has been incredible. And that is because the military are behaving as though they're subhuman, and they are I talked to, I have Burmese friends in Australia who are really, really close to events, and they, this is all very upsetting. I have a friend whose father is, in a 10-foot prison cell, and he's in his 80s, and she said to me, they are worse than dogs, and they are worse than they were the first time. The brutality, their imagination, to call, I heard Dr. Zasa on your program, and I've heard it before, how they will call up a doctor and say, I have COVID, can you please come to my house and treat me? And the doctor turns up, and they're then arrested and tortured and put into prison. That evil imagination to be even worse than the brutality of the first time. I think there was some kind of ground rules in a way, like while it was extraordinary, the stuff they did, but that's in 2021, they have an even greater propensity, like we are living through a pandemic, that they can commit these acts. That blows my mind and makes me so distressed. Children, 4-year-old children being in prison, they have no, I don't count them as humans. Yeah. And they should know better. They have seen better. The country can be better, and everyone can enjoy, the benefits of democracy and being able to do business and simple things like that. So, and then the fact that the Myanmar people are still going out on the streets, and they're still resisting, and they're taking up arms. My goodness. I've asked myself, what would I do? And I thought I would probably hide in my apartment under a bed, because there is a real risk of death or something worse than death. It's the torture that they do. There's the American Burmese, the journalist that was tortured, he got out because they found out he had an American passport. The stuff he has described hearing in his limited time is, this is like worse than a clockwork orange sort of thing. I can't fathom it. And if anyone has any answers, even how to reconcile in your mind that it exists, I feel that I need some help with that, because it's just awful. So that for me has been the most surprising thing. I thought they might be, I don't know, like better organised and less brutal. So I just, the people in Myanmar, people in Australia also worry about the consequences. They say, Jess, can you say this? Because I'm worried about what they might do to my family. And even, do the tentacles reach to Australia? And they may do. So, I find the people amazingly brave, and they will forever have my respect, no matter what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a confrontation with pure evil in ways that you are never quite prepared until you meet it. And I think that it's also a journey of acceptance of the depths of evil that they are, so that one is not continually being shocked and horrified of how could they, but there's some kind of understanding or acceptance of how that just a cold, detached acceptance that one is facing evil in the world. And this is something that many people can go through their lives never having to face in different eras. It was something that everyone faced to some degree, but as the world has gotten more civilized, I think that you can live lives in certain places where you don't face this to the same extent, but it's a shock to the system to see just a confrontation with evil, and then inside oneself, who holds on to certain ideals of humanity and values and ways of living, that then have to be confronted and decide to what extent do I hold on to these values while also confronting an absolute manifestation of evil in front of me. And that is also one of the most important things, to continue to get the word out to people outside of Myanmar that this is not nuance. This is evil. And how would you respond if you were faced with these situations? You described the Dr. Sasa referencing the patient, the army pretending to be patients and bringing out underground doctors. Perhaps an even worse thing that they've started to do is, and there's evidence of this, intentionally taking positive infected COVID patients, bringing them into cluster areas and intentionally infecting entire areas. So I don't know of any country in the world since the pandemic broke where they're not just being negligent or caught unawares or whatever else, but they're actually actively taking steps to encourage the spread to greater and greater amounts. And so, this is, just to say it simply and to repeat it again, this is a manifestation of evil happening in the world that one has to confront. And you actually have to confront it whether you're in Myanmar or outside. Whether you're there, you have to confront it in pretty egregious ways, because it can affect every aspect of what you're doing with your life. But if you're outside of the country and involved in any way or carried in any way, it still is a reorientation of how do I accept this for what it is, and what do I do in return? And that is a kind of crisis that you don't really know who you are or what you're capable of or how you feel when tested until you're thrown into that kind of situation to have to respond to.
And I've never understood how you can have these two types of people, in the one geographic area. So you have these uncouth brutes who have no humanity, and then you have some of the most gentle people in the world. Like, Burmese people, they don't carry knives or guns. They don't curse. They don't raise their voices. There is a beautiful gentleness to Burmese people. They are, not materialistic or greedy. And it's so... I always wonder, like, on a practical level, I mean, many people say with the military are brainwashed and they keep them in compounds. So they're almost like lab rats or something. I mean, you can hear my hatred, the hatred in my voice for these people. But I also feel like they must be a tiny minority of this. You're not born in Myanmar and grow up becoming an asshole. Like, typically you're quite a beautiful person because society, the things we talked about before, there's this social contract and the Buddhist values and those kinds of things. So how do you even get this other class of people, you know, I guess you'd have to seal them off. But then they have wives who come, they must come from outside. And how do they reconcile themselves to living it? It must be, like I saw a clip on TikTok of, it was a mass dance party, and it was like the first month of the coup, but it was, you know, things had turned bloody quickly. And it had been a shocking week of violence and murder, and it was all these military guys in their uniform drinking and dancing to, there was like a DJ, it was like a dance party. And I was like, you are dancing on the grave of innocent people and all the people that you're going to murder. And how do you smile? You know, yes, it's a drunken smile, and I bet they need to drink to get to sleep. But don't you find it extraordinary that, you know, like there are different kinds of societies. Like Vietnam, you've got to be pretty street smart, I think. You know what I mean? Like, and if you're too trusting, you might get taken advantage of. But Myanmar's not a society like that. So then how do you have such brutality? You know, the good and the bad, could they be further apart? I don't think so.
That's true. And I think, to me, one of those answers, well, you talked about some of the conditions in your response, in your comments, but to me, a big one, a psychological one, is I just think that there has been enormous repression and suppression inside the mind to survive, as a survival mechanism, to be able to get through the day. And I think that this suppression, this repression, the lid is off right now. You know, the lid is just off in what we're seeing. And one of the things that really impressed me from the start, and that was something that stood out, which I don't think would have stood out for anyone that didn't have a very close familiarity with Burmese society and Burmese people, was how many friends of mine were simply saying some version of, I'm not okay, like I'm upset. And that, you know, for people who don't know Myanmar, that might be like the understatement of the decade, of like, a coup just happened that took away all my freedoms, and life is now completely uncertain. And because of this, I don't feel okay. Like this might be like nothing stands out, but for a society where like you just simply don't hear this. I don't know if you know the expression anabade, where you don't really want to infringe on other people or bother people or upset them in some way, and, you know, have your problems be a burden on anyone else. And part of that burden is not really admitting a mental state or a feeling that is not pleasant, to not want to have that impact others. And suddenly there was this outpourings of, I'm not okay, and different versions of I'm not okay, I'm upset by what's happening. And that was an early indication of the tremors that were coming, that we are now possibly going to see an opening in dialogue and conversation that has never taken place before, this could be a watershed after the I'm not okays. And of course, that's happened to varying extents of, you know, looking at the young, especially the young Generation Z, exploring to various extents the privilege of being Bamar or Buddhist that other ethnicities didn't have. And we've seen an incredible extent of those kind of conversations and reflections starting to take place. And there have been other ways that's happened as well. But I think it's really the lid off to be able to contemplate what it means to admit you don't feel okay and to feel free in saying it. And it's so ironic, because when you talk about a Buddhist society, the first noble truth of the Buddha is that there is suffering. Suffering exists. Acknowledging you cannot make progress in transcending and letting go of suffering until you come in contact with the depth of all the manifestations of how that suffering takes place. And so saying I'm not okay is actually, you know, very in line with the first noble truth of the Buddha, that you are acknowledging that suffering exists. But for whatever reason of the military and society and everything else, just that simple fact of saying publicly, well, I'm not really okay in this situation, that is something that really doesn't happen in normal society interactions.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. And outpouring is definitely the right word. And I feel that people's relationship with democracy is like, it's almost tangible. Like, you took this from us, and it belongs to us, the people, and we want it back. And I feel like had it been, I think, the military misstepped. Had there been a coup in 2015, I think the world would have gone, you know what, that was an experiment. It was a failed experiment. And I'm so sorry for Myanmar. They left it too long and you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And I feel, young people, they've grown up half their life with democracy.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can get away with that in 2021 anymore. Like, Myanmar knows full well most countries are democratic. Even, in the rest of Asia, there might be variations of democracy, but, they certainly have more freedoms than what the military, they've overstepped the mark, and it's ludicrous, isn't it, what they're trying to impose. So I think that the strategy is just going to backfire because, had it been 5 years, like short, sharp, okay, going back to what everybody knows, but this time around it's too cheeky, Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And I imagine in your case, you're following the developments since the coup, not only what's happening, but also the way it's being reported. And so as someone who not just lived in the country, but also reported on it, what do you feel has been missing in the coverage of how it's being explained to the outside world?
Well, I guess my first point would be is what's missing? Well, the journalists are missing. So all the foreign journalists have left, and I'm not saying it in any way is it the foreign journalists. It's just more people on the ground to tell the stories. So they've all gone. I was surprised. Like I know, when I was talking to a journalist on Facebook last night, we both feel frustrated. We cannot go there and report. So German speakers, they cannot go there and report for, I tried to pitch a story about COVID, as I mentioned to you, to Nikai, and they said, well, you're not there. It'd be secondhand information. And that's completely as it should be. So there's, and the danger, and also, they've closed, like Myanmar, like all of them are now illegal entities.
Yeah.
So there is hardly any journalism, almost to the point that there is none. And the chilling of, poor Danny Fenster, just trying to leave Myanmar to get back home to his family, and he's in prison. That chilling effect on, there are a couple of journalists in, but no one has a byline anymore, Burmese or otherwise, and it is very frightening. To my goodness, I do not have the courage to still be a journalist in Myanmar, and I know photographers are still out there on the streets, but I've also equally seen I saw a journalist in a flak jacket with media across his back, and he was wearing a hard helmet, and he was being led away in handcuffs by two policemen to a van. So journalism is a crime in the military, even though we know that journalism is not a crime. So it's a blackout. It's absolutely a blackout. And to the extent that, foreign media can get stories, like I've seen the ABC, they're sort of relying, it's hard to verify much of the information. And to be honest, you wouldn't want to, some of this information that's coming out. And it is so, what's happening is so distressing. I know when I did my book launch and I spoke about COVID, I admitted a couple of details that I felt the audience just couldn't stomach, and I couldn't ask them to stomach when they weren't prepared. They hadn't walked in for them to be debriefed. They came to a book launch, But I think there's a certain amount that we're not hearing because it is not fit for public consumption, to be honest. So I think you and we still have friends there, and, you can be moved to tears by what you're told in an informal way. But I think a lot of it is just, it can scarcely be repeated, and it should be repeated, at the International Criminal Court. It's that kind of stuff. What they do to children, I get very upset just seeing, there was the pregnant woman that was beaten up, the medics that were beaten up, the people being thrown off their balconies. And it's real tip of the iceberg stuff, isn't it? So some people have been like, oh, Myanmar's not getting enough attention. I feel at least in the beginning that it did, and that the world is enchanted by Myanmar and is deeply distressed. Let's say comparative to the airtime that somewhere like Ethiopia gets, because it has people like Aung San Suu Kyi who, there's a romance associated with her. So, I don't have any issue in terms of the way that it's being construed or anything like that. But the logistical, practical aspects of even getting stories out, there was the CNN crew and they spoke to people and those people were then arrested. Mm-hmm. So, it was hard getting people to trust me in Myanmar. And I sort of touched on that in the book, that people weren't used to, there's the joke about the dentist, why mm-hmm. the Burmese man goes to the dentist in Thailand and the dentist says, don't you have dentists in Myanmar? And he says, yes, but no one opens their mouth in Myanmar. So, overcoming that when I was there in such a positive time, I couldn't always get people to speak to me and open up. Now, the consequences are potentially death. So I'm so sad that, I'm not understanding the full extent of what's going on. So, and neither is the world, because they're trying to do a blackout. I don't think they can quite do the internet blackout that they wish for, because, people understand VPNs and that kind of thing. And I'm not even sure if that will be their strategy, because you just can't close countries off in the way that you used to. Although China has the Great Wall, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is the most fundamental challenge to journalism, is just getting the stories out and getting those stories told. And, the recovery of the generation, like the 88 generation were processing what happened to them. And this, even just in 6 months, the trauma is going to be immense, and the telling will need to be told in future times. But gosh, we're so not even at that mm-hmm. point, are we?
So given those challenges, how do we continue to find a way to inform people what's actually happening? I'm thinking also back on the earlier protests. One of the things that's made this so different is that in 88 and even 07, there could be 100 students, or 88, say, because they were leading the 88 protests, or 100 monks in 2007 who overnight would disappear, and no one would know what happened. You might find out a few weeks or a few years later. There's stories of, all of a sudden student bodies washing up on the Irrawaddy, and people just noticing all the bodies coming, and rumors starting to spread that way, or a certain monastery that suddenly the monks all disappeared and there's bloodstains everywhere. Terrible, terrible stories. But at that time, there wasn't a way to be able to get these out, because there wasn't social media and there wasn't a background of independent journalism. So now in this complex environment where there is social media and there are many new ways of getting stories out and getting information, and yet, as you said, every formerly journalistic publication that was in Myanmar is now illegal except for the state organs. How do you navigate through this? How is it? Because it's so important to be able to have news and information and context and updates about what's happening. So how can that happen going forward?
It's tricky. Tricky is an understatement, isn't it? I think I see pretty incredible coordination among the Burmese diaspora. Reporting from, undisclosed locations and some disclosed locations, and I know, like, the Burmese community, I've been so impressed with their level of organisation, and they are doing concrete things, like they're lobbying so that the Australian government provides COVID vaccines. There are, of course, there's the National Unity Government who are also trying to coordinate things, and they're really leveraging the media as well, as much as they can. Again, we have that problem is, you're not on the ground. So that, that has to be a component of journalism. But, people still speak at great risk. And I think that's where human beings, like, when we're suffering, we need people to know. And so I think even at the risk of death, people will continue. You can't extinguish that determination to do that among the bravest of people. So we do have technology by our side, and, I was relishing the fact that, the military tried to turn off the internet and they just couldn't. And, there was the sporadic cutouts, and there's all these kinds of platforms, like Signal and things like that just can't be intercepted. Mm-hmm. So these are tools that they didn't have in 88. And things like Signal are wonderful because it allows, Facebook is frightening. Like, I have a friend in Australia who fled with his Burmese wife, and he was contacted via Facebook Messenger by the military saying, where are you? We are coming for you. Like, tell us where you are, like as if, and we're coming for you. And even if it was only, empty threats, this is how, they're leveraging Facebook. It was like, the information minister always, he was always using his Facebook page to announce things.
Right.
And he became, the minister of Facebook. But I think with some of these technology tools are very powerful. And again, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. People have mobile phones. So some of the old tactics that the military used are not going to work. They're not going to fly. And so they're going to have to, and I think they're saying, okay, let's scare them more. Let's think of the most disgusting thing we can do and we'll do it. And we'll just scare people into submission. But again, I just don't think the human spirit will be bowed down. But how many people have to die before they realize that? I think journalism, it's crude. Plus, we're in a pandemic. I mean, these twin crises are, again, I think partly why this big long delay, and I think the military thought, conditions are actually right for a coup. We don't have all these international observers here, nor can they come. They wouldn't dare come. Right. So it's this terrible, terrible, situation. So it's making, journalism in a pandemic is not safe. Journalism isn't safe at the best of times in Myanmar. And together a pandemic, who will still be standing kind of thing. It is that bad. Nonetheless, I still think enough stories will come out. Myanmar won't be forgotten, and as the protesters say, it won't be forgiven. So I don't worry that there'll be a total blackout, and the stories coming out are so powerful you don't need to hear many, I think, even as a casual observer, to be invested in what happens. And then I think people like you and I, I'm always sort of slightly uncomfortable. I am not Burmese, and I should, how much should I be talking about a country that isn't my own, but a number of my friends have said, you could do the story, like, Jess, maybe could you do this story, because I do not want to do this story because I have family in Myanmar. So I think we also have a role to play in a small way, things that you're doing as well. Having these discussions that are was so enlightening to hear Dr. Zassa speak in such detail was really moving as well. So we just have to keep up and never give up. Easy for me to say, isn't it, from my comfortable Sydney office?
Yeah, well, in your comfortable Sydney office, you have a freedom of expression that they don't have half a world away. And that's something we can never forget. And I think when looking at advocacy, I think it's very important to stare the white savior complex in its face and know what it is. And I think, there are ways of advocacy and support that don't fall into that. I was talking with this subject with someone just the other day and mentioning the two easy things that anyone can do. Number one, when speaking to a Burmese friend that's over there or someone whose family is, how are you feeling? How are you doing? What do you need? What's going on? It's as simple as that. It's just asking the question and listening, not why don't you do this? Or what happened if, what if you did it this way? Or why are you so upset about this thing? Or why not just, that's just garbage. Throw it out. That's not, that kind of pontificating is not from a place of safety and comfort. That's not something that anyone needs. But number one, saying, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How can I help? What's going on? That is a great way of advocacy. That is a great thing that anyone can do that is immediately supportive. And something that when I ask Burmese people in the country that come on my platform what's needed, that's one of the number one things said. It's so easy. It's almost counterintuitive how much that's actually important and helps at the time. The second thing is simply saying, hey, I'm a safe person. I'm a friend. I'm here when you need to talk. Just let the person know that you are someone that can be that they can talk to on a good day, on a bad day, about what's going on, about something trivial, but just simply, I'm here to talk, I'm here to listen, I'm here in whatever capacity. And these are ways that we can use our freedom and our safety and our advocacy that take advantage of where we are, who we are, and our role. And of course, as you mentioned, there are certain kinds of subjects and things that we are not as at risk as someone else who could do them. And And the same happens to me quite a bit, of people coming with either essays or stories or interviews or something of saying, this is what's going on, but I can't touch this. From your place of freedom and safety, can you touch it? And then, yes, I can touch it, but I'm not going to touch it by saying, hey, here's what I think about it, and here's my take, and here's my view. But okay, let's see what the story is, and let's use whatever platform this is to be able to have others be able to step up and use it and speak and talk and explore, and then get that out to as many people as possible. So it's those voices that are going and being shared and understood.
Yeah. And we can just simply provide the avenue that allows them to speak. So voices in their own words, not with, as you say, editorializing or whatever. I mean, if I like to sign off many of my conversations with just, I'm thinking of you, because we are thinking of the people, and, so you are not forgotten, sort of, because I think sometimes, I know most people feel very disappointed with the way that the world has responded, or, its lack of response to what's happening. So just, I'm thinking of you and I am. So that's something that I feel I can say as well.
Yeah, and it really just comes down to being curious and caring and asking questions. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I think everyone, no matter who you were, where you were, what your background was, everyone kind of had to reorient themselves towards, okay, who am I in this? What's my role? How do I respond? What am I doing? And I think one of the early things that I learned was, just because I'm not there, I have no role in even beginning to understand how it feels, and nor should I, and nor can I. But what I can do is ask people about their realities, ask them what they're dealing with. And the more that I find out what they're trying to do, how they're making sense of it, how they're configuring their own work, and where they're having problems or coming up short, then that's a place where one is able to see, oh, okay, well, there's this gap here, there's this thing that's not happening, and is that something I can do? Or do I know someone who can do it? Or do I know someone who knows someone that can step in? Or do I have a substitute of something that can help in some kind of way? And, that's something I've learned and tried to do early on, is just being able to ask questions and find out, do I have resources or know of resources that fit in what they're trying to do, because I'm in no place to advise or judge what those actions are, rather just to ask and be able to be supportive in what they feel they need to do at this moment for their safety and freedom.
Yeah. I think it's also amazing, like, how polite, again, this is beautiful Burmese people, like, I'll post something on Facebook, I'll say I spoke, so today, here's a link, to the podcast, and I spoke about the situation in Myanmar, and people will somehow find the time to say thank you to me to doing that. So it's like they're encouraging me, I should be encouraging them, like, keep going, like, you're not forgotten, but they're the ones encouraging me. I have a friend who's an MP in Sydney, and he on Sunday, said it's the 33rd anniversary of the 88, the resistance in 1988, and I'll be attending this Zoom conversation. And the number of people that, chimed in with comments saying, thank you, sir, thank you for thinking of Myanmar, you don't have to do this type of thing, just beautiful. Like, it's this spirit of, compassion despite the circumstances that they face. Somehow they still have the generosity to thank someone else for caring, so that, I'm often touched by that. And it's not, it was Jamie's page, my page, but so many, obviously I have a lot of friends who used to live in Myanmar, and it's an outpouring of gratitude for very simple expressions, posting a photo of a memory of Myanmar and expressing their sadness. I find it quite extraordinary. I think I would be tied up with facing the day-to-day, but that people are not. So I think it's just wonderful, on top of everything else they're facing.
Yeah. Well, you were talking before about the way that this was being reported, and a bit before we were going back to just the foreign journalists that were in the country, their relationship with local journalists. And so the last question I want to ask is about this topic. And I think that especially at this time, there's been quite a bit of scrutiny about who is telling what stories, and ownership of a voice and of expression. And I think the two fields this has come out most in has been Burma study scholarship and journalism, and just the need and the importance of having authentic local voices that are able to tell their own story. And this came up more than ever in, as you referenced, the CNN's Clarissa Ward's visit. So, and then I guess I should say as well, this is balanced with the concern that you mentioned that there are no bylines anymore, and that even if someone is not getting credit for what they're doing because they can't out of danger, there's a risk in being involved at any level that they themselves, if they're in the country or their family that's there, that as important as it is to have these local voices, that there's also extraordinary danger attached to that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this overall issue of the need for greater representation of local voices in journalism at this time.
Well, it's extremely difficult because the danger, the voice needs to be diluted for it to be safe. And I think the safety of the source has to be paramount, above everything. So, for example, I mentioned the friend whose father is in prison, and I wanted, before my book launch was delayed because of COVID-19 lockdowns, I wanted to tell her story. So I interviewed her, and she came back and said, I can't, I'm trying to get my father out of this 10-foot cell. And if you identify me in any way, that could jeopardize, him. Of course I understand. So I had to remove all the color, as we talk about as journalists of the story, that really it made it much less powerful because I couldn't mention, the age of her father. His story as an individual is very powerful. I'm trying to tell you this without telling you who he is.
Right.
So
right.
Do you see the dilemma I'm in? Now, I don't think we're in a time for literature or even anything like this. Is a time for survival. And for one, I know voice is important. I know that, but I think that we're really bottom of the pyramid. Let's keep people alive. Let's keep the journalists alive. There are so many journalists Burmese journalists in prison and who have been murdered. If we can get out the most basic elements of a story, that to me is success and actually quite remarkable. In terms of voices, no bylines. You can hardly disclose the location because after that story comes out, who's coming next? The military. Mm-hmm. So there are all these difficulties. So if you report on COVID, there's clinics are being set up by, private hospitals or whatever. But if you disclose this, the military, to try and do vaccinations, the military will come and open fire. So it's a real, but to be honest, principles of journalism and authenticity and stuff like that just have to take a back seat to me at the moment. That's my personal opinion, and I'm not sure. Academics, I hope they're not getting themselves tied up in knots over things that Burmese people don't have the time to consider while they're engaged in this, life or death battle. Is all I would say on the topic. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it absolutely does. It's just such a difficult, fraught time where even normal and mundane decisions have to be considered completely differently. So, so with that, I've really enjoyed talking to you. These 2 hours have absolutely flown by. Before we close, is there anything else you wanted to touch upon that any questions didn't address?
No, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It's been wonderful and I think cathartic in a way as well to speak. You're so knowledgeable, Myanmar, deeper than I do. So it's nice to, I don't have that many people that I can talk to, in this level of detail. So it's been really nice to be able to do that and to hear your views as well. And I hope that when I hang up, I don't think of all the things I wish I'd said.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's fun for me, at least, about this long form style podcast is that it really is done with more of an intention of a mature, informed audience. And I find one of my frustrations with whenever I would read about Myanmar in the news going back, 15, 20 years even, is that the whole origin story kind of had to be told in at least half of whatever the conversation was, and just the basic contours of history before you can actually get to any kind of real views or anything, because there was just so much informing. And so I think one of the things I appreciate about this platform, and I hope listeners do as well, is that we're starting off from a different place. So we're not having to go through what happened and when, and actually, wait, where's this country located? And, what are the main details of it? But we could actually jump right into some of the more detailed and layered conversations, looking at it from different angles, depending on the guest's background, and really start to dig into some of that nuance and trying to understand it at a greater level. So, hopefully it's as interesting as guests as it is for the people talking. But, the thing about the podcast medium is you so rarely hear that feedback. So it's always welcome for people listening. But I'm glad that at least you enjoyed the 2 hours as well, because I definitely did.
I really have. Thanks for having me. It's been great. Thank you, Joa.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this show. I understand that this is an enormously difficult time for many people these days, myself included. And just the mere fact of staying informed is helping to keep a focus on this pertinent issue. And the only way that we can do our job of continuing to provide this content at this very critical time is through the support of generous donors, listeners like yourselves. So if you found this episode of value and would like to see more shows like this on the current crisis, please consider making a donation to support our efforts. Either monthly pledges or one-time donations are fully appreciated, and all funds go immediately into the production of more episodes like this one. Thank you deeply in advance, and best wishes at this time. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are resisting the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Every cent goes immediately and directly to funding those local communities who need it most. Donations go to support such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, and the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies. Or if you prefer, you can earmark your donation to go directly to the guest you just heard on today's show. In order to facilitate this donation work, we have registered a new nonprofit called Better Burma for this express purpose. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is now directed to this fund. Alternatively, you can visit our new Better Burma website, which is betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. In all cases, that's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration. You've been listening to the Insight Myanmar podcast. We'd appreciate it very much if you could rate, review, and/or share this podcast. Every little bit of feedback helps. You can also subscribe to the Insight Myanmar podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you can't find our feed on your podcast player, please just let us know and we'll ensure it can be offered there in the future. Also, make sure to check out our website for a list of our complete episodes, including additional text, videos, and other information available at insightmyanmar.org. And I also invite you to take a look at our new nonprofit organization at betterburma.org. There was certainly a lot to talk about in this episode, and we'd like to encourage listeners to keep the discussion going. Make a post, request specific questions, and join in on discussions currently going on the Insight Myanmar podcast Facebook group. You're also most welcome to follow our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts by the same name. If you're not on social media, feel free to message us directly at info@insightmyanmar.org. Or if you'd like to start up a discussion group on another platform, let us know and we can share that forum here. Finally, we're open to suggestions about guests or topics for future episodes. So if you have someone or something in mind, please do be in touch. We would like to take this time to thank everyone who made this podcast possible. Currently, our team consists of 2 sound engineers, Mike Bink and Martin Combs. There's of course Zach Hessler, content collaborator and part-time co-host. Ken Pransky helps with editing, and a special Mongolian volunteer who is asked to remain anonymous does our social media templates. In light of the ongoing crisis in Myanmar, a number of volunteers have stepped in to lend a hand as well, and so we'd like to take this time to appreciate their effort in our time of need. And we're always on the lookout for more volunteers during this critical time, so if you'd like to contribute, definitely let us know. We'd also like to thank everyone who has assisted us in arranging for the guests we've interviewed so far. And of course, we send a big thank you to the guests themselves for agreeing to come on and share such personal, powerful stories. Finally, we're immensely grateful for the donors who made this entire thing possible. We want to remind our listeners that the opinions expressed by our guests are their own and don't necessarily reflect the host or other podcast contributors. Please also note that as we are mainly a volunteer team, we do not have the capacity to fact-check our guest interviews. By virtue of being invited on our show, there's a trust that they will be truthful and not misrepresent themselves or others. If you have any concerns about the statements made on this or other shows, please contact us. This recording is the exclusive right of Insight Myanmar podcast and may not be used without the expressed written permission of the podcast owner, which includes video, audio, written transcripts, or excerpts of any episodes. Also not meant to be used for commercial purposes. On the other hand, we're very open to collaboration. So if you have a particular idea in mind for sharing any of our podcasts or podcast-related information, please feel free to contact us with your proposal. If you would like to support our mission, we welcome your contribution. During this time of crisis, all donations now go towards supporting the protest movement in Myanmar through our new nonprofit, Better Burma. You may give by searching Better Burma on PayPal, Venmo, Cash App, GoFundMe, and Patreon, as well as via credit card at betterburma.org/donation. You can also give right on our Insight Myanmar website, as all donations given there are directed towards the same fund. And with that, we're off to work on the next show, so see you next episode.
Đây, đã, đây, 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 đây.